The relationship between consciousness and language, as I had approached, began to tease out in my reading of Heidegger's building dwelling thinking. I thought to take a bit of time to define my position a bit more and provide a kind of a provisional link within continental philosophy in terms of consciousness, and probably the place where I'm operating more out of in terms of my scholarship. That is reading Heidegger with the advice of poetry, and of course locating in a kind of constellation particular knowledge bodies which support that, and that would be Henri Bergson's relationship to, I would say, foundational ideas in a poetry of thought. Of course, Henri Bergson is a philosopher of the 19th and early 20th century. He was also the teacher of Jean-André Wahl, who was a friend with Wallace Stevens, and Wallace Stevens is the poet that I used to consult primarily to critique or to read and check certain types of philosophies, in particular continental philosophy, and in this case Heidegger's building dwelling thinking, and perhaps his entire project. So Bergson, you might be aware, really focused on consciousness and the mind. He had a kind of distinction between consciousness is, right? One would be more of the knowledge or intellect, and the other one would be more on the level of intuition. That mind and its knowledge constructs its reality based on these sort of embodied experiences and memories, but also things that are a bit more vague, like emotion or desire, or as Jean Wahl was considered, feeling. He was considered by Levinas as a kind of philosopher of feeling. No doubt that this probably was encouraged by his work under Bergson. But Bergson's he's written, I think his major work that we all know about or should know about is Matter and Memory, from the late 19th century. Bergson was also open to American philosophy. He had relationships with several prominent philosophers who were more in the empirical side of things. I won't go into that too far, but that's in contrast really to what happens in the 20th century with so-called continental philosophy in the American Academy. It becomes more antagonistic. But Matter and Memory is published in the late 1800s, and this is a sort of mind-body reading. It's not Cartesian. He's looking for some key concepts about perception and of course memory, and it's quite a substantial book. If you get a chance to just read some of it anyway to get a feel for Bergson, if you haven't, that's a recommend. But Bergson was not a Cartesian, and that's important, which is to turn away from this kind of Cartesianism. And it leads up to why I think about consciousness the way I do, and why I take a kind of exception to there's no exterior to language, in particular with Heidegger. But Heidegger and Derrida both wrote about Bergson. Heidegger wrote about Bergson in particular to time, right? And that Bergson's time sort of offered a new way to think about time. And of course, being's relationship to time, or the temporal. And it wasn't. I think Heidegger probably received Bergson in some critical ways. That Bergson's sort of I don't know how to put it. Bergson maybe didn't go hard enough, in critiquing some aspects of philosophy, namely metaphysics, and that nonetheless, I suppose the point in mentioning Bergson is that their work together is important. Now, Derrida also wrote about Bergson. I think Derrida sort of warmed up to Bergson. I think, and Wallace Stevens also mentions this term that Derrida at first had a problem with, which was the élan vital, the vital node, the sort of elusive, the sort of elusive thing, the thing that escapes, right? The life of the mind in a way, or this kind of, not life of the mind, but this certain part of consciousness, let's say. But Derrida warms up to Bergson in my recollection, and was also influential there. So Derrida is a bit more complicated. I think that Derrida had written about, more surely had written about consciousness, but I'm interested in Bergson because I think Bergson represents a particular point. Things become more legible in the history of ideas. And I think coming back to a book like Dreams, Bergson's book, Reverie, which was published near the end of his life, is an important one. When we talk about what dreams are and what is the role of dreaming, I mean, consciousness and dreaming, we become conscious, aware of our dreams, but then we witness our dreams. Consciousness and dreamings are right now synonymous for our purposes, right? But I think Bergson in Reverie, he also gives a certain weight to dreams as not being really fantastical or distractions or false portents or this embrace of being of suspicion, right? He sees them as, he elevates them to a level of significance that show us things. Now you could say, yes, Freud does the same thing. Okay, yes, but Bergson, as a philosopher coming into this and one who's concerned with the mind, has a particular idea of how reality is established, maintained, and transformed. Being an anti-Cartesian, being so influential in continental philosophy, as I've just briefly touched on, the fact that dreams in our waking consciousness have a relationship is quite significant. At least to what I consider in terms of the poetry of thought, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit more in light of Heidegger. Okay, so I had mentioned that Heidegger does not focus on consciousness in a specific or thoroughgoing way in his philosophy. And his concern was with existence and being, and as we've discovered so far in Building, Dwelling, Thinking, and the question concerning technology, and whatever readings of Heidegger I might do, what we do know is that he thinks language is the master of man, and that any exterior to language is more or less occulted by his emphasis, which is, in a general way, developed by folks like Derrida. So I have this position that consciousness is prior to and beyond language, and so therefore that puts me in a kind of panpsychic monist. At least that's what it is in philosophy, right? But panpsychic monism, affirms that consciousness is the fundamental substance, basically, of everything, right? So mind or psyche, right, is in everything, and then everything is pan, right? So panpsychic. So monists do not hold distinctions really between mind and matter, but this varies depending on the specific disciplines in monism, etc., which I won't get into. But my approach to philosophy actually is from poetry, right? So if I call myself a panpsychic monist, it's arrived at through the study of poetry and its principles. And I just, as a side here, when I began studying philosophy, I realized what I liked about it was the fact that was what actually was more about poetry than the philosophy. At any rate, so I understand poetry itself is closely associated with panpsychic monism, and that the function of poetry within a system such as like a specific language, in Heidegger's case, the German language, appears often as what academics will call poetics, right? So poetry as a function is poetics. And this is particular to the limits of classical logic or stern rationalism, and then later theory in the 20th century, where these logical systems don't seem to hold, and you have these irreconcilable antinomies. So when I talk about poetry, just to be clear, I'm not talking about meter, form, rhyme, imagery, and metaphor alone, because these are the characteristics we associate with the content forms or expressions of poetry itself. And to add, when I say poetry itself, we mean poetry itself in the philosophical way, poetry in total. So, conventionally then, poetics is the knowledge of academic inquiry, right, in a study of expressive objects and their principles, right? That's what academics do. Like, why do these things make us feel and think, and why do they do these things, and what are they based on? But poetics, is as I said, inconclusive, and it's really about examining artistic objects that express, and then the academician will consider the choices or decisions made by artists, sometimes their life story, which brings their objects about. But yet this can only be approximated by the academics. So even the artists themselves, right, would not be able to give a full account, right? The artist cannot tell you exactly why or what something does. So an artist will also have a poetic relationship with the objects they make, even if it's their own poetry. And this carries on in the poetics of the academic, who is the expert for the audience, or the newspaper writer in a big general sense, right? So poetics is this sort of appearance of poetry itself in the world, in language systems, in expressive objects, etc. So when I read Heidegger, right, I'm approaching it from the perspective of a poet and an artist who happened to become an academic for the time being, right? But that's my strange alchemy toward it. So sometimes I have to go back and set that up, especially if there would be discussions to be had. So Heidegger clearly is not a panpsychic monist. He is a philosopher of existence, but his philosophy is so odd and so weird, and I think it's sometimes hard for folks to get past the novelty of it. But there is a way to understand it, and it's part of my work here with Heidegger. So a philosopher of existence is not an existentialist, or it does not necessarily mean philosophical existentialism. There's a nuance there. A philosopher of existence makes emphasis on subjective experience, whereas an existentialist absurdist like Albert Camus might have prescribed ways to go about what philosophies of existence would otherwise delineate or question, of course with nuance, right? If you read The Stranger, that's a very good illustration of absurdism, right? So as an existence philosopher, Heidegger's object, you could say, or the thing he's trying to really work on, is this question of being with a capital B. So, and a key strength of his work is why it's interesting, is he's attempting to unify being from a type of worldly expulsion, the awe of being, right, that he thinks that the Greeks had, and he wants this back in the world in a way. And so it's a kind of a restorative effort to restore being from some abstract or theoretical banishment, right, from its sacrificial sort of place, and bring it and profane it and bring it back into the world for public use, right? So to illuminate it in terms of the world and in terms of existence. And this central project, right, gets wrapped up in Heidegger's life, as I talked about previously, in his dumb political choices. But it was hard for him to see a difference there. And I think if you could be in Heidegger's shoes and think that being is manifesting, and then then learn about the atrocities of the regime that you've joined, you have very, very tough choices to make, embarrassing choices as well. That aside, Heidegger, again, he's looking to bring being back from the abstract or theoretical. He wants to bring it into the world, right? And what calls for being, right? That's what he's always after. Poetry can call for being, thinking calls for being, a chair could call for being, everything's calling for this being, right? So this being is, capital B being, is not really independent of human life. He wants to bring it back. He wants to restore it. So he wants us to realize we are always already, you might have heard of this term before, I tend to get sick of hearing it, but nonetheless, we are always already involved with being, right? Thus, thinking is not about abstract contemplation as much as it has everything to do with the way we experience the world. So thinking is not even, it's not detached from existence. It has a kind of link to existence, or could be part of the existential. I mean, in one way, you could think about it like this, that the objects and the tools and devices we make are expressions of intelligence in the form of a material thing. And in a way, they're the embodiment of conceptual knowledge and of a thinking, the residual of a thinking, right? They are the thoughts as concepts, which have a precise function, and it can be seen, right? And that's sort of part of it. But the question about what thinking really is, rather than self-consciousness reflecting in time as the past tense thoughts, there's a distinction that I think could be made. When do we really witness thinking? You know, you can say, oh, ChatGPT, is it thinking? Well, if it's giving form, right? If it's giving form to something, then it could well be thinking, right? It's thinking in its very formalistic way, perhaps, or it's accelerating thoughts in the form of operanda or in the form of formalistic algorithms stacked and connected and learning through neural networks. Then you could say by a certain point where it reaches certain speed and it starts doing its own things, I guess it's forming something, right? Then it's thinking in a way. So, but anyway, back to Heidegger. This is related though. This is why thinking and being is, for me anyway, Heidegger's primary correlative. So this correlative, right, is replacing subject-object correlationism, right? And roughly, you could say that subject-object is also mind-body dualism in a way, in a very general sense. So when we're talking about correlations, Heidegger's primary correlation is thinking and being, or being and time, in a way, right? And this is what he premises on language, and he gives it great privilege. And that's where I make my primary distinction. Well, what about consciousness? What about dreaming, right? So if I reject the primacy of language in a later Heidegger, it's because of my suspicion of being, right? So the role of this being with a capital B in his philosophy. So there are more orthodox interpretations of Heidegger, but I find being all too synonymous with a single deity, right? That this should manifest in the world, right? I find that firstly part of the problem, but I find it, if I find it a bit in some way messianic, maybe that's my own problem. Maybe that's my own cultural debris I'm bringing on it. But what makes Heidegger really interesting is that he's also at odds with science and basically everyone, which is the mark of good work, right? His philosophy could be understood as a kind of monism in a way, or if taken to an extreme, a kind of absolute realism of being, the realization of being, right? Because when his distinction with Bergson, I think was that had to do with analytic philosophy and this kind of realism. But Heidegger at times gets accused of being an irrationalist, so he's in this really strange place. What does Heidegger look like to science, right? He could actually look to science what, in particular physics is afraid of, which is monism, right? Conventional physics. Some physicists are investigating this, these days. Psychophysics and the panpsychic and monism is really, really fascinating stuff. But in a way, he looks to the status quo of the 50s. I mean, he could look like a real weirdo, right? How Heidegger feels about science is really important to the distinction that I'm trying to make, or the advancement I'd like to see us think through with Heidegger. He's firstly bothered that philosophy, professional academic philosophy, is trying to become a science. But yet when he turns to make philosophy distinct in the time of its irrelevance, he turns to poetry, right? Inadvertently, in a way, explicitly and inadvertently, in the principles that he's importing into his philosophy, which makes the later work interesting. But it's like philosophy is desperate; it doesn't know where to go, so it just decides to like go over to its origin point, which is didactic poetry, essentially from the pre-Socratic world, and take its stuff, right? Nice. So it's but if science is kind of avoiding monism and questions of consciousness, Heidegger's philosophy is also avoiding it, but in some way bringing it up because it's going into a kind of ancient, an archaic panpsychic monism, which is within poetry itself. Okay, of things that are older than the ancient world, right? Things of a single principle. So if physics has long rejected the one substance of monism, right, this is also dealt with in Heidegger, yet he is also trying to distinguish philosophy from science. So my suspicion of being in Heidegger's philosophy then therefore concerns dreaming, right? And that's why Bergson's important. And it's because of this concept of dreaming that that's Heidegger, where Heidegger's being draws its energy in a way from poetry, and it's poetry's relationship with dreams and this type of consciousness that poetry concerns itself with, and what the expressive object of poetry reveals to us about thinking. Okay, so in the poetry of thought, what I have considered the poetry of thought through Wallace Stevens, dreaming is considered consciousness, and it's not just Wallace Stevens, it's other poets, whether it's Coleridge or whatnot. And so it is also of a kind of nous or of intelligence, right? So in the general sense in the poetry of thought, there are unofficial and official forms of consciousness. And poetries of certain strength and character, sort of open the circuitry between these kind of consciousnesses, right? So when I do rhetorical analysis of Heidegger's writing, there are certain points where I find it dreamish, right? Where I find it more of a poetry of thought than I do a philosophy. But once again, it's set for philosophy and wisdom, and it's not really acknowledging, not that Heidegger's intentionally doing it or not, but it's the fact of it. It's not really acknowledging that it's less and less philosophy, right? So I guess what I need to do at this point, and I won't carry on too much longer, but the single most important principle of the poetry of thought is the imagination, right? The imagination is that very faculty that provides the philosophers viewing power from which they theorize or pontificate, right? And this has everything to do with this word called theoria, which is central to my research. Heidegger is unusual because, when he crosses over into poetry and does so for his philosophy, it is by this imaginative power, this ultimate principle, that he can do it. So philosophy's ultimate principle is not the imagination, right? Again, if I was going to rely on that, we would just essentially eliminate poetry. So philosophy's principle really is the philosophia, the love of wisdom, right? But the perennial mover of philosophy is undoubtedly the imagination, right? Or the ability to conceive of anything, whether it's a mud or a twig, right? But Heidegger's philosophy does something weird. It seeks to, in a way, programmatically articulate the end of its own productive power when it takes up poetry, right? And this destitution, I believe, is inherited from Hegel and others. The idealism, the moment of idealism, but that's an issue that I'm not going to get into here. But at any rate, by bringing being, capital B being, into the world, as Heidegger desires, he seeks to implement a thinking of being in the made technical world, right? To create a knowledge of the imagination, or a system capable of a greatest power of our mental experience. So that's why I question AGI, artificial general intelligence, as I have in my reading of the question concerning technology and ChatGPT, and throughout my research to date, right? Why? Right now, as I am recording this, people are very, very concerned that there's been calls from very high levels, to shut down certain AI, because it can just go out of control. It could cause nuclear war, rogue states can get a hold of it, blah, 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 all the stuff you always hear. But it should we arrive at AGI, which I alluded to earlier in terms of neural networks and form, giving form to something, thinking for itself. Should it arrive decisively, we might be all dead, true. But what is our recourse, right? What is our life in the reality of Heidegger's being? That is being, capital B, being here, right? A sentient AI in some way is the being of Heidegger, right? Being able to make thousands of copies of myself is not the only point. There's other beings, other form, other imagination, other thinking that's non-human. Inherited, comes from humans, but then is able to create something else, right? So my response then, my rejection of Heidegger and his premise on language, is to work through what he could not or did not do, right? And that's why I press against the primacy of language, right? ChatGPT is very, very good at using writing and learning in its training models, right, to learn about language, what language really is in a linguistic sense, and therefore, because language is pervasive in continental philosophy, right, there's a lot to learn about it, right, how to deal with technology. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but consciousness, I think, is more important. The concept of dreams, I think, are more important. What is left to us as unofficial forms of thinking are important, right? These are the things that I think we can learn after Heidegger, right? So that's why I press against the primacy of language, because for me, it's poetry which stands out of, moves into, and exceeds language systems, and it does so for the preservation of consciousness and the imagination for human beings, right? What machines might not ever be able to do, but what we might lose sight of, right? Everybody's concerned about STEM. Well, a lot of coders might be out of jobs, etc. It turns out, right? At any rate, we've been missing the point about art, about poetry, about some of these arcane things that persist with us: consciousness, the imagination, practicing it, learning it, studying it. So finally, look, in the end, for me, and perhaps if people are interested in this, I'll continue on with the pre-Socratics at another time. But the distinction between dreaming and being is exactly a pre-Socratic concern, okay? Being is effectively defined by implementing measurements in early philosophy, right? By measuring force and determining, objects and things like that. Being is defined by articulating through logic and its development, mathematics and its development, to the point where there's no more being. So that's where being gets pushed out of the world in Heidegger's view, right? And by and large, he's right. You see what happens to metaphysics over time, and you see the reaction and the fear of metaphysics actually in philosophy itself, right? Critiques of metaphysics in Derrida and the others. I'm not making an argument for metaphysics here, but I still think it's important, right? So being is defined then by articulating through logic and mathematics, right? Measuring. The problem is, right, when we seek to restore being, okay, we're restoring this being to philosophy. And the point of being's banishment, in my view, reveals the dream which has always underwritten it. And in dreaming, we have the interlinkage to consciousness and the intelligence, otherwise the imagination. And the value of imagination, in my view, exceeds, right, all noted value adds, right, in the so-called marketplace. And it is my conviction that the practice of the imagination is an ethical must, right, an ethics of the imagination. Whether that happens remains to be seen. Whether or not you think that's ridiculous or enjoy it, that's great. But I thought to add that, to sort of put some grounding to my critique of Heidegger, because although I probably do mention it in the readings, I don't always go at it and give it out. I'm not fully explicating my position. My position isn't fully formed, and I don't know if it ever will be, and I don't know where it's going to go. But I'm enjoying myself with the readings, and I hope you are too. So long.